Lee, in the case for the real Jesus, you investigate whether there are other Gospels other than Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John that present a more accurate picture of Jesus.
Right.
I remember years ago a friend of mine got all excited because he said, you know, Mark, you've limited yourself to the Bible, and I found a book that shows you the lost books of the Bible. And he was all excited to show me this other information.
Yeah.
And a lot of people are into that these days and talking about it, and one they get really excited about is the Gospel of Thomas.
Right.
And I know you've looked into that. What have you concluded, and what do you write about in your book about the Gospel
Well, you're
of
absolutely
Thomas?
right. The Gospel of Thomas is the most popular of these so-called alternative Gospels. In fact, I saw a bulletin for a church service at a church on the East Coast recently. And in it, it had a responsive reading where the congregation was reading back and forth. And they were reading from Thomas right next to John. So they were accepting the legitimacy.
But a lot of people would say, well, they're both disciples, so what's the difference?
Well, that's a very good question. So what I did in the case for the real Jesus, I went out and I interviewed, a leading scholar on this issue, Dr. Craig Evans, who is not only a incredible intellect and widely published and highly respected, but he's highly respected by both the conservatives and the very liberals who are theologians and New Testament scholars. So you have someone who's universally well respected. And I asked him the tough questions about the Gospel of Thomas. And what he said is, look, Lee, the evidence shows the Gospel of Thomas was written about 175 A.D. to 200 A.D. Now, Jesus was put to death in 33 A.D. So here we have something so long after the fact.
Like 150 years later.
Exactly. It has no real relevance in terms of what it says about Jesus. Now, here's the reason people like it, Mark. The Gospels in the Bible refer to Jesus as the Redeemer, the one who died to atone for our sins and so forth. The Thomas Gospel is more in the Gnostic flavor, which is talks about self-knowledge, salvation through self-knowledge, through self-discovery. In fact, it talks about the spark of divinity within. If we can just discover our inner divinity like Jesus, then we can be like Him.
It's got to be in there somewhere, huh?
Exactly. I mean, it's just this Gnostic idea.
But people like hearing that today. Is that what
That's
you're saying?
very affirming, because it isn't saying, hey, you're a sinner who needs forgiveness and the atonement of Christ's death and the cross on your behalf. Instead, it's like, oh, you just need some knowledge. You just need to learn about, Jesus is a revealer, not a redeemer. He's revealing knowledge to you. And boy, if you're really smart, you're going to get it, and you'll find out you're divine
kind of plays
too.
to my pride almost.
It really does play to our pride. So as we look at this, what do we find? Is it legitimate? Because the other Gospels are all written right there in the first century. They're like right on the scene. So they contain fresh information about Jesus. If this Thomas Gospel was really written 175 or 200 A.D., it's so long after the fact, its historical credibility
So it had nothing to do with
shot.
the Thomas of the Bible.
It doesn't have anything to do with the Thomas of the Bible. And in fact, one of the reasons we know that it's later written and not earlier, and therefore not as reliable, is because it either quotes or alludes to or refers to 14 or 15 of the 27 books of the New Testament. So it was already written at a later date when it could refer to these other books that have already been written. There is no Christian writing out there from the 2nd century that knows this much of the New Testament that was written before 150 A.D. Okay. Secondly, there are Syriac connections that have been discovered recently in the Gospel of Thomas. Let me give you an example of what I mean. The Church of Syria did not receive the Gospel until about 175 A.D. When they got it, they didn't get Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. What they got was a blending of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. It was called the Diatessaron, where they sort of blended it, someone blended it together. Well, in doing that, they created new forms of some of the sayings of Jesus. Those new forms we see echoed in the Gospel of Thomas.
And not the earlier one.
Not the earlier one. So therefore, it comes after the Diatessaron, which was in 175 A.D. You see some of the order and arrangement of the material in Thomas also is reflective of the Diatessaron. It also refers to Thomas as Judas Thomas. Well, nobody does that except the church in Syria. What's more, if you translate the 114 sayings of the Gospel of Thomas into the Syriac language, what you discover is it's not just a jumble of unrelated verses like most people think it is if you read it in Greek or you read it in English. And if you translate it into Syriac, you find catchwords that are repeated through to link them together. So verse 1 has a word that's repeated in verse 2.
It's like a pattern.
It's a pattern. It's a memory aid to help them memorize it. So if you translate into Syriac, you begin to see that. Well, that just is another confirmation that this is a later book, after the Syrians had the materials from, learned of the gospel in the second part of the 2nd century.
Lee, does it contain any useful or helpful or real information about Jesus?
Well, there are some echoes of Jesus. There are some sayings that kind of are echoes of the original Gospels. But, Mark, that's like me saying, you know what, I'm going to write a gospel about Jesus.
Today.
And I'm going to make up the fact he came from a UFO, and he's from the planet Neptune.
And I think someone wrote this already.
They probably did. It's probably a bestseller.
Yeah.
And I'll make up this entire thing. But you know what? I'm going to kind of pepper my writings with a couple of quotes from Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. Well, now all of a sudden, I can legitimately say some of my gospel about Jesus goes back to the 1st century.
Sure, it's true.
It's true. It goes back to the 1st century. Well, so what? Even if Thomas does contain some echoes, which it does, of the Gospels. In fact, it includes some of the later forms, by the way. Mark's grammar in the New Testament is not the best Greek grammar. And Matthew and Luke sort of improve and polish his grammar a bit. So that's later. And those are the forms that you see reported in Thomas. Another indication it's later, not earlier. So, I could sprinkle a couple nuggets from the real Jesus, from the Gospels, in my writing and claim some of it dates back to the 1st century. Thomas, same thing. The key question is the dating of Thomas early enough to convince us that it has material that dates back in its broad teachings to Jesus himself? And the answer is no. Okay. It's dated between 175 and 200 A.D. There were no Thomas Christians running around in the 1st century, as some liberal scholars have said, following Thomas as opposed to Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. If that were true, we would see reports of that in the early church fathers around the turn of the century. We don't see any of that. So, Mark, this idea that there are alternative gospels that are every bit as legitimate as Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John is a claim that just does not withstand scrutiny.